Okay, dear colleagues, a warm welcome to all of you. Those of you who attended our first webinar know that these events are part of the series Reimagining Childhood Studies. My name is Spiro, together with Rachel and Sharada. We're organizing this series with two more planned webinars following this one. The next one will be on the concept of refusal, and the last one on liberalism's erasures. We have organized the seminars slightly differently than traditional childhood studies panels by taking up three concepts or ideas that to date haven't been widely taken up in childhood studies, but are part of broader scholarly discussions. We're using the seminars to consider their productivity for childhood studies. Our hope is that in doing so, we can push the doxes and boundaries of current thinking in the field, even if the concepts prove problematic or less than productive, although we hope that is not the case, and open up new ways of bringing insights from childhood studies to these broader debates and developments in social theory. Before going on to introduce our topic for today's webinar, I would like to share with you our plan for the webinar and some practical details. For today's event, we have three distinguished scholars who will offer us their insights into the concept of slow violence as it relates to childhood and childhood studies. We have Professor Yao Ofusu Kusi from the University of Education in Ghana, who will talk about African childhoods through the lens of slow violence. Then we have Professor Peter Kraftl from the University of Birmingham in the UK, whose talk is titled Plastic Childhoods Beyond Toxic Renderings of Children's Intersections with Toys, Waste, and Other Plastics. And the last presentation will be delivered by Professor Erica Miners from Northeastern Illinois University in the US, and is titled Racing to the Ends of Childhood Studies, the question mark at the end. This part of the event will be coordinated by Sharada. The remaining time will be devoted to questions and answers. For purposes of efficiency, we will only use the Q&A function for questions and comments. If you would like to address your question to a specific speaker, please mention their name. Also, it will be good if you write your name and affiliation when you post your question. The Q&A session will be coordinated by Rachel. And just to clarify, the chat function will be open. Already some of you are writing, but it will be open for comments and discussion the whole time. We only ask that you use the Q&A function if you wish to pose a question to the speakers. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded. We plan to make these webinars available to those who cannot attend and potentially create an archive for students and scholars engaged with the project of reimagining the field. And now I would like to say a few introductory remarks about slow violence, the topic for today's webinar. In his book, some of you might be familiar with his work, but in his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Rob Nixon introduced the notion of slow violence as, and I quote here, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all, end of quote. This kind of violence, which builds up over long spans of time and is delayed in its effects, is to be contrasted with the more instantaneous and spectacular violence, for instance, the violence of war, which cannot escape our attention because it is readily and forcibly visible. The imperative for critical scholarship is to acknowledge, record, understand, and counteract this form of violence, which often remains invisible or is easily forgotten or dismissed. Nixon's argument is mainly centered around environmentalism and the effects of slow violence, whether expressed in terms of deforestation, toxic buildup, acidifying oceans, or climate change on the poor. The concept of slow violence, however, is sufficiently productive to allow for new applications beyond those examined by Nixon, be it the chronic trauma of housing dispossession, as in the work of Rachel Payne, for example, or the experiences of refugees in camps, as in the work of Davis and colleagues. In the same vein, the concept has invited critical refinements and reconceptualizations. The attention to slow violence draws to notions of change and movement through time and across space, allows for a more dynamic and critical look at unspectacular time and its violent manifestations. In that sense, it invites us to reflect more deeply on and pay more attention to the temporalities of violence, especially those which often shroud the existence and manifestations of everyday violence. Though childhood studies is not new to similar notions and processes which problematize perceptions of violence in childhood, such as structural violence, it has not so far considered the concept of slow violence in any significant way. Exceptions, for instance, would include the work of De Liu, who has used the concept productively in the context of state violence on Indigenous women and children in Canada. Today's webinar aims to provoke discussion about the potential utility of slow violence as a critical concept for researching and theorizing in childhood studies. We ask our three invited commentators and our audience to reflect on, among others, the following questions. When, where, and how could the concept of slow violence in both its spatial and temporal manifestations be usefully applied, elaborated, nuanced, rethought, or expanded in our work with children in childhood? Which childhoods and which children become casualties of slow violence? What kinds of new politics and forms of resistance can future work on slow violence engender among children, their families and communities, and scholar activists? What new collaborations and alliances with other fields and disciplines might we need to engage in order to apprehend slow violence and its effects on children? How could we address the representational challenge of crafting powerful, convincing narratives that capture the wider imagination about the urgency to tackle slow violence in childhood, when such forms of violence remain unspectacular and elusive? So these are obviously only some initial questions to get us started, and Sharada will now take over and proceed to introduce our speakers, who will offer us their own insights and thoughts on what slow violence can offer childhood studies.
Thank you, Cyrus. So it's really wonderful to be here with everyone, and I'm really honored to be able to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Yao Ofusu Kusi, who is a professor of social studies and is currently the Dean of the School of Arts and Social Studies at the University of Energy and Natural Resources in Sunyani, Ghana. Yao's research, as several of you know, has primarily focused on the informal economy, children's mobility, labor, and street life. His most recent work includes the challenge to African potentials, conviviality, informality, and futurity. And in 2017, he edited a volume called Children's Agency and Development in African Societies. He has, over the years, directed Codiceria's annual Child and Youth Studies Institute and has been a guest professor at the University of Flensburg in Germany, and has taught courses on African childhoods, children's rights, child migration, and labor at universities in Ghana and Europe. And I currently have the pleasure of working with Yao on a British Academy funded collaborative research project on children's participation in Africa, Europe, and Asia. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Yao. And we look forward to hearing from Yao today on his talk entitled African Childhoods Through the Lens of Slow Violence. So over to you, Yao.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarada. And thank you, Rachel, and everybody for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. It's a novel experience for me. We've done this in Ghana, but at this international level, it's quite an interesting occurrence. I'd like to begin by saying that naturally, there are different categories of childhood in Africa. This is why I chose to pluralize my topic by saying African childhoods instead of African childhood through the lens of slow violence. Now, that pluralization gives an idea of the diversity of childhood in Africa. Nixon says in his book, which is quite pivotal to what we are doing now, that the poor is a compendious category. And I think I should say as much about childhood in Africa. It is also a compendious category, very diverse, broad, but to try and differentiate it or disaggregate it, we have to think of childhood in our different countries. Even within countries, we have to think of whether a child is living in the rural area or in the urban area. We have to think of the color of the child, whether she is Black, she is white, she's Arab. We have to think of class and economics, so whether the child is coming from a certain economic background where, for instance, the parents have stable income and are able to provide their needs. And obviously, we have to think of religion, because this is very, very critical to social and religious lives in Africa. Whether the child is from a Muslim and Islamic family, from a Christian family, or from traditional African religion. Now, when we think of this diversity, I think what comes to mind greatly is the fact that, unfortunately, many of the childhoods in this diverse form are beset by a number of challenges. In fact, these challenges have motivated some to even coin the term third world childhood. And this childhood is usually characterized by poverty, by destitution, by lack, by exploitation, and in our particular case, by exposure to violence. Now, obviously, if at one end of the continuum, we have a third world child, then there must be a first world child at the other end, which I think will be characterized by everything I've just mentioned in the opposite direction. But it also raises the issue of Zaliza's priceless child, whereas many childhoods in Africa are again characterized by economic activities from the children as a contribution to their parents' economic life. Well, perhaps that isn't exactly the case in the majority of cases, hence Salisa's work, for instance. But there's a gray area between the two, supposedly the first world and the third world. And so the diversity will show that it is not always the case that one could say emphatically that every childhood in Africa is one that is defined by lack and poverty and destitution and so on. There is a very good category of children, maybe even broad one, that has some of the semblances of what childhood is in the first world. And I suppose maybe in the first world there will be some instances of childhood that portrays some of the characteristics of childhood in the developing world or in the so-called third world childhood. But what this tells us when we try to link this to what we are interested in is the fact that although every child is susceptible to violence, there is every evidence to show that children who are from poor families, as the majority of children in the childhood that I've just tried to elaborate are from, are more susceptible to violence, whichever form we look at it. If we are interested in direct or personal violence via Galton's work, or we think of violence in a traditional way, where using some of Nixon's word is spectacular, where that violence is instantaneous, where it is heart-rending when one is exposed to that. Many of these children are exposed to it. When we think of violence in a different form, the form espoused by Nixon, where violence is supposed to occur gradually, where it has delayed destructive effect, where it is dispersed across time and temporality is quite important. We have these children also, in a way, experiencing that sort of childhood. Now, having given this introduction, I'd like to address some of the issues you raised, and for which reason we are supposed to try and connect what we have to say, or at least what I have to say, some of them. And in the first instance, I want to think of childhood and children and how they become casualties. And I'll do this by giving specific examples. Now, as I've just noted, every child anywhere in the world, because of their nature, because sometimes of their underdeveloped physical appearance and abilities, can be intimidated by adults like ourselves or bigger children and so on. But again, when children are in certain situations because of circumstances, when children are in certain situations because of inabilities to have the preferred kind of childhood, those situations could be quite problematic for their development, and for that reason could generate a certain amount of violence that might not inure to their benefit. And so when we think along those lines, I'd like to say that the large number of children in Africa and maybe in the wider developing world that engage in child labor, without doubt, exposed to the different forms of violence. And if they are exposed to personal or direct violence or structural violence, then by a simple extension of their imagination, we can argue that they are equally exposed to slow violence. Now, ILO in its 2016 global estimates of child labor says that as many as 72.1 million children in Africa are engaged in child labor, of which 31.5 million are involved in hazardous forms of child labor. And here I'd like to use an example from Ghana. We have a big lake called Lake Volta that has lots and lots of freshwater fish in them. We have professional fishermen who are largely fishermen. Men do the fishing. We have thousands of them who work along the banks of the lake. But it turns out that many of them are preferred to use children as their assistants for the simple reason that their nets get entangled in submerged branches and in tree trunks. And children, because of their nimbleness, are able to swim to the depth and disentangle the nets. But this has empirically been found to be very, very destructive to children's development. Some of them, because of the effort to disentangle the net, get cuts and lacerations on their bodies. Some of them contract waterborne diseases. It's known that when some urinate, for instance, traces of blood can be found there. And so what I'm trying to point out here is that immediately one thinks of children who are involved in child labor, instances of different kinds of violence, but in particular slow violence comes to mind. Similarly, when we think of street children, an area that I have the greatest interest, and I have a little bit of experience, in research and interacting with children in those situations. As many as 8.1 million, according to International Labour Organization, are found in the services sector, mostly in the informal sector, in places like streets, lorry parks, all kinds of places in the urban areas. Now, obviously, if the right place for a developing child is the home, and this child migrates from a rural area or from wherever to a city and is on his or her own without any parental guidance or any significant adult making important decisions in the child's life, then the child's level of exposure to violence of any form will greatly maximize. Now, unfortunately, we cannot talk of this without bringing in some of the conflicts and wars in Africa. And the most notable is the one in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that interminable war, according to Africa Renewal, has had 5 million people losing their lives. Obviously, if that many adults lose their lives to the ravages of war, one can easily speculate that there must be thousands and thousands of children who have been rendered parentless because of the impact of wars. And the fact that they have no parents, but also the fact that they must have experienced the direct impact of the wars, leaves a certain amount of scars on them. And these scars clearly may have their instantaneous impacts, but they have a long way to go in terms of how they implicate the lives of these children in the future. To give you just another example, Nigeria, Nigeria to be precise, where Boko Haram's insurgency has created considerable havoc. As many as 22,000 people are supposed to be missing. Included in that number is the batch of schoolgirls from Chibok who were abducted by members of the organization. Recently, we had a similar case about some boys that were also abducted from school. I mean, supposing that the government finds them tomorrow and they bring them back, the harrowing experiences that some of them went through, the trauma, the nightmares that they had was with them. These are things that will live with them forever. It may have all kinds of implications for their lives. We can also think of housemates, which is also another problematic aspect of how children are seen and treated on the continent. Unfortunately, what happens there usually happens behind closed doors. So empirically, it's always very difficult for people to have precise accounts. A lot of what we hear and say and read could be speculative. But without any stretch of one's imagination, one could easily think of children who are raped, children who are beaten beyond any, no form of beating, no form of punishment that is physical in nature on a child is acceptable. But we know that many of them have this. And lastly, we tend to equate some of the forms of activities children engage in the developing world or in Africa with the fact that they are being socialized. So for instance, when we think of child labor, some people will say that, well, it's part of their socialization. They are doing what their parents did. That is all right as far as I'm concerned, except that sometimes this socialization becomes completely toxic to the present state of the children as well as to their future states. So these are about 4 or 5 examples of children who, by the kind of activities they engage in, are clearly exposed to violence in an instantaneous form, but also violence that has the element of temporality as advanced by Nixon and others. Now, the next part is how do we advance the cause of slow violence if we want to bring this into our effort with researching and discussing and having conversations about children and childhood. And what I think instantly, as one example, I'll leave the rest also to have a look at that. But what I think instantly is that it pushes us to engage in more interdisciplinary work and research. We in the social sciences are very happy with our single authorship. So a lot of times we do, write our own papers. Whereas in the medical sciences, for instance, there is extensive collaboration. Sometimes there are 7 or 8 authors to a single paper. I think that in trying to move forward this idea of slow violence in childhood studies, we should bring different minds. We should concentrate ideas and minds and focus on a single item, but from different dimensions. For instance, a social researcher like myself who looks at say, children's life and labor on the street, I may be able to look more on the social aspect, perhaps on the economic aspect, but I have no expertise to look at the psychological implications. I have no expertise to look at the changes in the physiology of the child. I have no expertise to look and study and try and make conclusions or informed decisions about the slow poisonings that children are exposed to are from the noxious gases from vehicles or from open drains and so on and so forth. And so going further, I think if we want to think of new forms of politics and new forms of resistance, then we have to re-engage authorities. In Africa, they have had a blank check for a long time. NGOs have been doing their work, but the work has mostly been on the violence that we have known in the past, on the structural poverty that is very easy to see in the ways and lives of people. But when we begin to think in a violence in a nuanced form, as we are trying to advance, then there's the need for us to actually re-engage the authorities. Many of them are not even aware of the concept, and we may have to find ways to make them become more familiar. There is obviously the need for a shift in the political pressure that NGOs try to exert on authorities. And I think if we engage them as well, if we have more seminars, for instance, in Ghana, if we bring people with the expertise to talk more and make them become more conversant with the concept, I think they would have been empowered by the end of it all to be better at promoting the other side of violence, which for now, at least in my country, we have been very, very silent on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Yao, for that. Yeah. Thank you, Yao, for that really kind of brilliant talk. And I really think that you not only complicated assumptions around the third world and the first world child, but also the ways in which you shared local examples of street children as well as child laborers, not only spoke to the attritional aspects of slow violence, but through the example of child soldiers, you also spoke to not child soldiers, children who survived armed conflict. You also spoke to the exponential aspects of it, and then kind of ended with saying how we can re-engage authorities. So thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions for the panelists, you can post them in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And we will be taking your questions at the end of all of our three panelists' presentations. And when you post your question, please include your affiliation as well. So moving on to our next speaker, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Peter Kraftl, whose work most of y'all are already familiar with. Peter is a professor of human geography at the University of Birmingham, and he has held visiting positions at MIT, Otago, Chilping, and Ontario universities. His research focus has published prolifically, and his most recent book is Our Childhood, which I'm teaching this semester. So I'm really looking forward to teaching that book. He is particularly interested in children's interactions from city infrastructures to plastics, to the sources of their food, water, and energy. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a previous editor of Children's Geography, and is currently a member of the Directors Collective at the University of Birmingham's Children and Childhood Network. Peter's talk today is titled Plastic Childhoods, Beyond Surrenders of Children's Intersections with Noise, Waste, and Politics. Over to you, Peter. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Sharada, and to you, Spiros and Rachel, for inviting me. I hope you can hear me okay, because Sharada's sound quality wasn't great, so just to make sure the connection's all right. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so if you could just give me a moment. Can you see that okay? Great. So thanks again for inviting me, and also for inviting me to think about the concept of slow violence, which is not one that I've thought about previously in my work. So I found this opportunity really generative. And I haven't really written about violence explicitly either. So it really made me think in some different ways about the work that I've been doing recently about children's varied entanglements with plastics of different kinds. And what I'd like to explore today is a range of ways in which we might think about children's engagements and non-engagements with plastics, and plastics related in some way to childhoods, beyond and also with notions of violence, toxicity, and so on. And I'll explain kind of what I mean by that in a moment. The first half of the talk, and we've been asked to keep it fairly brief, I'll just explore some kind of conceptual signposts, which I think might be useful, especially in developing those kinds of new collaborations, those new conceptualizations that Spiros asked about in his questions at the beginning. And then just tell a few quite diverse stories, again, kind of in a similar way to how Yao gave his presentation of childhoods and of plastics in both Brazil and in the UK. So I've also used the quote that Spiros used at the beginning in introducing the seminar, because I'm particularly interested in Nixon's notions of a slow violence as it's dispersed across time and space. And I won't read this longer quote from Tom Davis, who's been writing about slow violence in the context of refugee camps and other contexts recently. But two things stood out to me here in terms of, especially of the spatialities and temporalities. And here I come from my position as a geographer. Firstly, in terms of what he calls these layered deposits of different social brutalities. And that really resonates with me in thinking about the very materialities of plastics as they circulate socially, but also physically in environments, whether as microplastics, tiny microscopic entities in our oceans and our watercourses and in the air, or as macroplastics, as larger plastic things, either as waste or toys or whatever they might be. But also, as Tom says in his work at the end of this quote, how these may well lay waste to the future. And so here I wanted to kind of ask two questions. Firstly, and again, as Spiros mentioned, the idea of slow violence heralds this idea of the implicit invisibility of what Tom calls toxic geographies. But I want to ask whether, nevertheless, we might still witness some of these everyday entanglements with plastics, using some methods that might be quite familiar to us as childhood scholars, but perhaps others that might not be. Secondly, I'm also interested, and perhaps this is more controversial, in the different moral and affective patterning of toxic substances like plastics, which may be conceived as bad and may have all kinds of negative consequences for health and otherwise. To ask, as Heather Davis and Donna Haraway, amongst others, ask, if these plastics are going to stick around with us, as they will for centuries, if not millennia, can we learn to live well with them? Can we learn to live with them as queer kin, as Haraway puts it? Can we learn to value them in certain ways? I think there are other starting points and other conversations to be had here, and I'll just flag these very quickly. But they sort of factor into this notion of what I've called thinking after childhood. So thinking after childhood as a concept, but also putting childhood into much longer temporal frames. And here, Tim Morton's work on what he calls hyperobjects, objects which really resonate with the concept of slow violence, like climate change, like the sum total of all plastics on Earth, like styrofoam cups, how these are hyperobjects which we know exist, but which are both so large and simultaneously so small that we can't witness them in our ordinary everyday lives. Nevertheless, plastics, like those other kinds of large objects, phase into and out of our phenomenological frames. And so I want to tell in a moment some stories of how that phasing might happen. And these are, as Ian Bogos puts it, speculative realist modes of witnessing plastics and their entanglements with diverse childhoods, which, drawing on Yao's talk, do require interactions with and modes of transdisciplinary scholarship. So they require us to look beyond the normal frames, I think, of childhood studies. But I'm also inspired here by the ways in which these kinds of hyperobjects like plastics are nevertheless socially patterned. And in particular, how some of these objects might stick in certain ways to certain kinds of bodies. And here I'm inspired by critical race theorizations of matter and its stickiness, particularly Vanessa Agard-Jones, who writes about the stickiness of chlordacone, a particular chemical substance in Martinique, an island in the Caribbean, and a form of slow violence associated with that chemical, and the ways in which that factors into questions of colonization and of the Black bodies that live in Martinique. But also in my own work, I've tried to develop notions of what I call infragenerational relations. That is, of thinking not only about intergenerational relations between adults and children, but about how those generations might be more than human in all kinds of ways. So what might it be like to think forward to future generations of children not even yet born who will have to live with plastics, or of the ways in which children themselves today think about plastics and think about how they will live with those plastics as they decompose over different timescales in their futures. I won't answer all of these questions now, but I'd like to tell a few stories that might help us to broach some of these starting points. So I'm going to talk about some findings from the Plastic Childhoods Project, which use a diverse range of methods, and I don't have time to talk about all those methods today. The project was funded by the UK's Leverhulme Trust and involved methods as diverse as social media analysis using kind of large-scale social media harvesting to look at how objects related to childhoods, like toys, lunchboxes, diapers, circulate through social media, literally and as well as metaphorically. It involved a whole range of artistic practices through some workshops at a local school in Birmingham. And I'll show you some of the outcomes of that later. It involved mapping, working with young people to map their encounters with plastics, as well as you can see at the bottom here, and this is where some of the transdisciplinary scholarship comes in, attempts to measure through biosampling the presence of plastics and other chemicals in children's breath, their urine, but also in water and soil in their environments. Clearly a whole range of ethical considerations there, which we had to consider and which I'm happy to talk to at the end if the conversation goes in that way. But I'd just like to tell a few stories from this work, which also involved observational components from visits to various places, including Brazil, where I'll start. So the first encounter, or the first story I want to tell about plastics is about this doll. So I'd like to take you to Sao Paulo in Brazil and to the neighborhood of Luz. Luz is a socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhood very near to the center of Sao Paulo. It's characterized by very high rates of large-scale tower blocks, which are more or less vacant and were left vacant sort of 20 or 30 years ago, and have since, in the terms of the city, been squatted by a range of very poor residents. There are often, during this phase, there have been kind of clearances of some of these blocks, so that the residents have had to leave at very short notice, leaving behind their belongings. And this is where we encountered this doll as we took a walk around one of these blocks, this doll that was left amongst all kinds of other kind of detritus and traces, if you like, of the people who'd lived there. And for me, this was a poignant and also difficult reminder of one of the many forms of violence that was being experienced by the child. I'm assuming that this doll was owned by the child who'd left this doll behind. It was one of a number of objects just kind of washed to the side in a corridor with clothes, boxes, and all kinds of other things. A kind of plastic trace of a childhood and of a child who I've never met and I'd never spoken to, but who will have had to undergo constant moves between different tower blocks and undergo a whole range of difficult conditions in their life. And this then brings to mind the work of Mel Chen and a range of other critical race theorists who write about what they call, in their words, plastic crap. So the ways in which plastics become associated with racialized, classed, and other patterned forms of discourses, which serve to very often dismiss the viewpoints and experiences experiences of those who are living with disadvantage. And so Huang, in a fantastic piece about the Pacific vortex, the plastic vortex in the Pacific Ocean, writes about toys that are left in that vortex and to all intents and purposes are forgotten because the vortex is in the middle of the ocean, away from most forms of civilization. Yet there are some discourses that relate those plastics, specifically in the United States, with Chinese plastics and Chinese manufacturing and Chinese toys in ways which are very stereotypical, very dangerous, very challenging, but also very generalizing. So there's a series of questions then about how this notion of plastic crap becomes racialized, classed and patterned when at the same time these toys may be associated with very specific experiences of childhood and violences experienced by those children. So I'd like to move to Birmingham now to a workshop that we did with some children in one of the secondary schools there. One of the workshops entailed us finding a whole bunch of plastics, again, plastic crap that was left in skips, in charity shops and a whole range of places. And working with some artists, we invited the children who were aged between 11 and 14 to create sculptures of different kinds. We talked a lot about the negative consequences of plastics. They were extremely well versed because of debates about plastics in the UK over the last few years about the environmental and health consequences of plastics. But we also invited them to think about how plastics might be valued in other ways. So here, for instance, the students built this sculpture, which has a kind of human-like presence, including plastics that they thought could be valuable in some ways. The plastic flowers being a particularly poignant one, where they talked about graves that people couldn't attend and couldn't put real flowers on, because they couldn't attend them regularly. So they would use plastic flowers as a way of memorializing relatives or friends that they'd lost. So we really tried to encourage them to think otherwise about plastics and to think about other kinds of engagements with plastics that go beyond notions of toxicity, both in terms of the environment and health, as much as they were aware of those. So I kind of want to just open the conversation out to some of those other forms of interactions with materials like plastics. The third thing we did with the students, as I mentioned, was to take samples of their breath and their urine. And fortunately, we didn't find plastics in their bodies. If we had, that would have been an indication of some serious health issues. But we did find a range of elements within their bodies, including aluminium, titanium, and zirconium. Now, what's interesting about these, and here we had some artists visualize the various sources of aluminium in a city like Birmingham, is that they come from all kinds of different sources, both historical and contemporary. I wanted to point out two things about this in terms of slow violence. Firstly, we have increasing knowledge that air pollution of various kinds, not only plastics, but in this case, aluminium, does have various health impacts, but we still don't really understand what the long-term effects of those will be on children exposed to them right now in the future. And these were children living next to and going to school next to a major road in Birmingham, where we found quite high levels of aluminium. And secondly, this is an example of these kind of infragenerational relations. So some of the smelting and industrial sources of aluminium are from the 19th century in Birmingham. And some of these forms of air pollution are going to kind of stick around in the earth and in watercourses for many years to come. And so there's an open question about, again, how we live with these kinds of pollutants in the longer term and what kinds of slow violence they might rid. So, as I've said, I see these as kind of questions of infragenerational concern, of more than human generations, as these materials like plastics, but not only plastics, may stick around for generations, how they may compose, decompose, coagulate, and sometimes concentrate within children's bodies with effects that we still don't really fully understand. But we also know that plasticizers and other substances are entangled in the very possibilities of childhood. As Heather Davis and others have written, plasticizers may actually affect the very fertility of our species as humans. They can have effects on the sex of babies when they're born. So there are some very real physical effects that plastics and plasticizers might have, But again, we need to question whether those are all understood as forms of violence or as forms of changes to our species and evolutions to our species as our environments are changing. So just to finish then, I think plastics and stuff like them raise a whole series of difficult questions. And again, I'm grateful to the organisers for asking me to think about these in terms of violence. And I'd leave you with two difficult questions. Firstly, in our explorations of stuff like plastics, how do we deal empirically with these kind of unbounded, uncomfortable, elusive, slippery, synthetic materials that aren't like the toys or the clothes that we might witness if we just talked to children or observed them? So what is the role, for instance, of environmental nanoscience in helping us to understand these kinds of infragenerational relations? And secondly, as Spiros himself has written, if plastics may be toxic and enact socially patterned forms of slow violence, how can we decenter children to look at stories like the doll in Sao Paulo, but also recenter those childhoods in ways that enable critical generative debates about our current and future entanglements with plastics? So I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Sharon is having some problems with her connection, so I will take over at this point. Thank you so much, Peter, for bringing in so many new and interesting ideas to our thinking on slow violence, which really open up our ability to think about this concept both within childhood studies, but also beyond. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Erica Miners. Erica's current research on prison abolition, childhood studies, and queer social movements includes a co-edited anthology titled The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom, published by Haymarket Press. A co-authored book titled The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, published last year by Verso, and another book titled For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, published in 2016 by the University of Minnesota. A distinguished visiting scholar at a range of universities and centers, including the University of Pittsburgh, Trent University, CUNY Graduate Center, the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, and Chicago's Leather Archives and Museum. Her work has been supported by the Illinois Humanities Council, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and a Soros Justice Fellowship. The Bernard J. Brummel Distinguished Research Professor at Northeastern Illinois University. Erica is a member of her labor union, University Professionals of Illinois, and she teaches classes in justice studies, educational studies, and gender and sexuality studies. Most importantly, Erica has collaboratively started and worked alongside a range of ongoing initiatives for liberation, particularly movements that involve access to free public education for all, including people during and after incarceration and other queer abolitionist struggles. Erica, thank you so much for being part of this webinar.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am going to share my screen, and I'm not a PowerPoint goddess, but I thought it was really important to have some visuals while I was talking today. I'm really honored to be here. I want to just start by thanking my panelists so much to think about and so much to talk about. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm really humbled to be here, and I am also deeply appreciative to our organizers. I reside in Chicago, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe land, and I'm always interested in more internationalist moves, and it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm here to learn. So thank you. So in my 12 minutes today, I'm going to offer one tiny slice about how the child, particularly the idea and the figure of childhood, makes forms of slow violence imaginable and naturalized. I'm going to explore what might need to be undone, dislodged, rethought, to offer even a temporary interruption in the reproduction of these harms. I offer today some provocations about our contribution to this effort as scholars working at the edges of childhood studies. And I also want to ask today, how might an abolitionist lens reframe our thinking and our practices? So today I'm also going to offer sort of 3 fast stories, and I'm a fast talker, trying to get my maximum out of my 12 minutes today. I'm going to offer an origin story, a little bit of how I came to this work. I'm going to offer a story about stagnant bodies, and I'm going to offer a story or a provocation about abolition methods today. So that's my plan. First one, origin stories. I am somewhat of an interloper in childhood studies. I arrived in this field in part because of my abolitionist organizing work in the United States and noticing repeatedly how children, both imagined and real, shaped campaigns and associated logics surrounding the criminal legal landscape. For example, the innocence of some children fuels criminal legal reform campaigns to close youth prisons and to limit youth sentencing. So children don't belong in cages. In these campaigns, youth are often exceptional, innocent, changeable, rehabilitatable, and therefore merit differential treatment and policies. Of course, this argument has had some traction in my state, Illinois. Just last year, the governor announced that the state will close existing large youth prisons focused on restorative justice, and young people will receive wraparound services and intervention. Yet these same logics, youth as exceptional, also extend and simultaneously buttress the rationale for life without parole for adults and a myriad of other forms, often more insidious, of carcerality. So white child protection, for example, is used to expand public registries, mandated reporting laws, and criminal legal background checks. Not only do these forms of carcerality, registries, and background checks fail abysmally to protect any child and do not act as a deterrent to stop harm from happening, but they actively work to make the lives of flesh and blood children, to use the frame of scholar Anita Bradford, more insecure. Child protection repeatedly surfaces across the political spectrum, remarkably effectively to diminish the lives of bodies marked as adults, but also to harm those framed as children. So to get out of this organizing cul-de-sac triggered by the child, this idea of childhood, I turned to historians, many people on this call, literary scholars, critical race theorists, feminists, artists, and others writing and studying the figure of the child. And I found myself often at the edges of the field of childhood studies. From Robin Bernstein to Jose Munoz to Holly Brewer, I learned that the child is a flexible, queer, and often dangerous category, gifted to some, denied to others, and a burden to many. People with disabilities are perpetually infantilized. Black, brown folks as early as pre-kindergarten are aged up or assumed to be older and punished as adults, while 20-year-old affluent white people are aged down and marked as emerging adults with a get out of jail free card. And always in my contexts, a version of this echo. Far from static, these categories, child, youth, adult, mask the wildly uneven and harmful ways that life-giving attributes, innocence and culpability, are parsed across race, gender, and ability. So chronological age is not a neutral fact, but a vector of power, as historians Field and Surratt stated in a recent roundtable in the American Historical Review. These very classifications, adult, child, youth, perform a kind of slow violence, the ontological disqualification of many, and annihilation so casual unspectacular, matter of fact, that it is simply common sense. Just offering a quote from the poet and theorist in Fred Moten. So part 2, stagnant bodies. In the heart of the largest incarcerated population on the planet, in the only prison left in the United States built to Jeremy Bentham's specifications for the panopticon, I teach, learn, and organize alongside people, someone's siblings, parents, lovers. Disproportionately Black, brown, and poor, all are serving life without parole, or what incarcerated scholar Phil Hartsfield calls football numbers, sentences of 122 years, 96 years, 87 years. In my state, Illinois, there is no parole. This is death by incarceration. In the United States, a 2012 Supreme Court case, Miller v. Alabama, ruled that mandatory sentences of life without the possibility of parole are unconstitutional for people who committed their crime under the age of 18. The case built on a 2005 Supreme Court decision in the United States that outlawed the death penalty for those whose crime was committed while under the age of 18. Both decisions relied on the common sense that children and youth are different from adults. As Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan wrote, children are immature, was mentioned 4 times in the Miller decision, impetuous, and fail to appreciate risks and consequences. As importantly, throughout these decisions, emerging scientific evidence, neuroscience and psychology specifically, scaffolded their arguments. 18 years old was drawn as the bright line. And of course, 17-year-olds should not be put to death or spend the remainder of their lives in prison. But the people I know were almost all over the age of 18 when they committed harm, some horrible acts. They were 19, 20 years old, 22, 24, perhaps 35. Most have now already survived decades inside. They struggle to be accountable for the harms they have committed. And like all of us, they're not the same person that they were 20 or 30 years ago. They stagnate in a system that, despite its name, corrections, has marked them adults, mature, not impetuous, and ready to bear the risks and consequences. So childhood studies is hardly solely or even primarily responsible for marking these bodies as disposable, stagnant, unable to be accountable for the harms they've committed or to change, a peculiar kind of slow violence. Yet far from innocent, childhood studies incorporates a way of knowing, an ontological foundation perhaps, that renders the stagnancy of these adults a lingering, distasteful common sense. Yet no field is monolithic, as aptly illustrated by this series, and childhood studies also has agitators, and I'm heartened by the breadth of scholarship within childhood studies that aims to trouble these genealogies. For example, just flagging 2 scholars that I've been following, Lauren Silver and Julie Garland, and Lauren's framework of transformative childhood studies, or Julie's idea of, can we have a concept of childhood that's premised not on innocence, but on justice? Or the editors of the recent volume, Reimagining Childhood Studies, who helped to organize this call in part, their wonderful introduction pointedly reminds us of the persistent weight of the psychological foundations of this field and our struggles to dislodge these anchors. So many of the people I work with inside prison are astutely informed about the emerging field of neurology and psychology and other aspects of what gets called adolescent development. Poring over scholarly journals, they expertly cite research that illustrates that the brains and bodies are still changing at 24 or 26. They're filing briefs and working to assemble robust arguments that the mantle of youth and childhood should be extended. Its halo might purchase their eventual freedom. I argue with them, this is not the way, but what are the tangible alternatives? So part 3. Third story. I hope I'm not going too fast. Abolition methods. And this is more of a provocation. At a small scholarly convening on childhood studies in Pittsburgh several years ago, I was at a session, and during the question and answer, someone offered that they identified as a child abolitionist. This was before everyone on the left actually moved to identify as an abolitionist. They offered this comment, in my interpretation, both in jest and not, to the thicket of complexities one panelist had raised, particularly related to sexuality, queerness, and age. I responded later in the question and answer that I was not necessarily against being a child abolitionist, but that term abolition had a specific historical references and resonance, particularly related to movements for Black freedom, that if it was used in relation to childhood, we should make these genealogies, these histories that are never simply in the past present. So I've been thinking about this comment in relation to this panel today in a discussion about slow violence. And perhaps the intervention of abolition is precisely the queer provocation that is needed to reframe the stakes of the field, to animate a political landscape, to render visible the slow violence always inseparable from identity, particularly race, and incurred by the ontological register of childhood. What if we childhood studies scholars took up abolition as a method? I suggest approach or method in part to avoid yet another disciplinary turn. A focus on method or mode of inquiry, a way of approaching questions, might permit us to squarely recognize these thorny questions of ontology, but not, as the editors of Reimagining Childhood Studies flag, simply raise one ontological turn with another. Also, method or approach in my book is active, reflexive, contextual, curious. So what might an abolitionist approach to childhood studies resemble? I turn specifically to 19th century abolitionist organizers who recognized that abolition was not simply a negation, the removal of structures, the eradication of formal de jure chattel slavery, for example. Abolition must also be an opening, precisely the rethinking of categories and institutions. Or as Angela Davis, interpreting the amazing scholar W.E.B. Du Bois writes, Du Bois argued that the abolition of slavery was accomplished only in the negative sense in order to achieve the comprehensive abolition of slavery after the institution was rendered illegal and Black people were released from their chains. New institutions should have been created to incorporate Black people into the social order. So across the United States, when running or in motion 12-year-olds, when a running or in motion 12-year-old can be a life or death question, this is Tamir Rice, either shoot the thief or smile and revel at the play and the joy. When this is read entirely through race, place, space, gender, and more, the work is beyond urgent. What might an abolitionist method resemble in childhood studies, perhaps? Perhaps interrogating the concepts, language, and terms made available by the state or the field that often incur these forms of slow violence. Perhaps questioning the very foundations of the field and always working towards the field's obsolescence. And of course, seeing ourselves in alignment and accountable to mobilizations and movements for freedom. I am in, are you? Thank you. I don't know how, I stop share, I press the button. Great.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica, for a brilliant presentation. Lots to think about. I think one of the things that I'm really taking from what you've just said is the way the category child itself serves as a form of slow violence. You have this beautiful phrase, gifted to some, denied to others, and a burden to still others. And I think you're proposing some, not just a critique of an analysis, description, and critique of the slow violence that we see, but an abolitionist move, a decentering of the child, a questioning of the foundations of the field, in a way that I appreciate both the call to historicize slow violence, but also to place moves, whether it's an abolitionist childhood studies, a critical or transformative childhood studies, to place those in the histories of movements, social movements, histories of movements against white supremacy, and so forth. So as a provocation and as a process that's connected to these larger fields. So thank you very much for a stimulating talk. I'm now going to, if you give me a second to do the technical bit, I'm going to bring the three speakers into the conversation and try to start picking up on some of the questions that people have been posting on the chat. Just as a reminder, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and that's where you can post your questions for the speakers. And I won't be able to cover, we won't be able to take them all, but we'll try and pick up some of them. The first question that I'd like to put to the panel, and I'm going to ask everyone this question, is one that was posed by Tanu Biswas. Tanu asks, would you say that first world childhoods are at least partly upheld because of third world childhoods? I ask because first world life standards can be maintained because elsewhere people are deprived, provide cheap labor. Perhaps difference in childhoods can be understood within the larger global inequity dynamics. I think I want to start with this question because it seems to me that all of your presentations in various ways speak to this sort of a question about who is included and who is excluded through processes of slow violence, but how those processes are connected. So I'll open it up. Yao, I'm going to offer you the first response. And then we can hear from Erica and Peter.
Thank you very much. Interesting question. I think the difference between the different types of childhood is obviously the imagination of whoever came up with that first. There is some amount of deliberation that must have gone into that. And clearly, when you think of where the different kinds of childhoods are experienced, then you might want to think that, yes, there could be that, that differentiation. But how does it come about? I think it comes about through the world economic order. I mean, African scholars and others have for a long time deliberated on how unequal the global economic system is, and to how very little is obtained for the produce from Africa, and how that inequality fits into the contemporary impoverization of some African countries. I mean, it may be that it is the workings of the market, but some are very well convinced that it is a deliberate effort to make products cheap, for instance, raw materials cheap. It is a deliberate effort to bring down the cost of production of certain things so that you can maintain the standard of living of others. All right, if we consider that by paying prices, for instance, for cocoa that people think are unreasonable because it doesn't really cover the cost of production and leave a reasonable amount for those who engage in the production, from the planting of the cocoa trees to the harvesting and drying of the beans. Because if I may digress a bit, I mean, a bar of Mars chocolate may be just about £1 in the US, but a ton of cocoa, which is about 16 bags, is less than 2,000 pounds. So if you put this in perspective and think of how many bars of Mars chocolate that a ton of cocoa will produce, it makes no sense that only 1,600 pounds on average is paid for all that many bags of cocoa. And so obviously, if the farmer becomes increasingly poor as a result of the very low prices that they obtain for their commodities, it will feed into the child's quality of life. And so maybe that upholds the differentiation. Consistently, one group of children are able to enjoy a certain standard because of availability of certain products that might have come about as a result of the sweat of children on the other side of the globe. And so I think clearly the World Economic Order has a big role to play in all this. And when we think of slow violence, we should think along those lines as well. Thank you. Yes, I'm okay.
I was also struck by that phrase, during your presentation, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk about it. And I really just appreciate your kind of tracing of the sort of economic tentacles that bind so-called first world to so-called third world children. And I'm also just reminded, just as a footnote to your point, of the wonderful US historian Elsa Barkley Brown, who wrote several decades ago, in part looking at white women and sort of the feminist moment. Beautiful quote from her, sort of white women live the lives they do because women of color live the lives they do, right? And she was arguing that white women have, possibilities to move into the workforce in part because, what sets of economic relations and what systems make it possible for women of color to be doing childcare, for doing home cleaning. So this sort of, white women live the lives they do because other bodies live the lives they do. So I just want to echo that. And I think that question is a really helpful question to have us sort of point to those sort of structural relations. So thank you.
I also wanted to echo that in another way, in that with this kind of question, I'm always drawn to the work of the feminist and children's geographer Cindy Katz, who writes about childhood as a spectacle and contrasts the spectacle of especially middle-class consumer childhoods and all the stuff that is bought for those children and the ways in which they're figured in advertising and elsewhere, with what she calls, in a provocative sense, children who are figured as the waste of the world, those children who are kind of held in reserve to work by the global capitalist system. And when they do work, they may work on recycling sites in dangerous conditions, experiencing some of the slow violence we're talking about, but also in producing the stuff that holds some first world childhoods. I think that's always a useful another useful frame for understanding some of the same processes that Yao and Erica have just mentioned. I'm also drawn, though, of course, to the differentiation, as Yao also mentioned in his talk, of childhoods, for instance, in Birmingham, and the ways in which Birmingham, which is a very diverse place economically, also especially culturally, the ways in which simply children living by major roads, by dint of geographical location, but also their background, may be exposed to some forms of pollutants more than others. And of course, that factors into questions about, much longer standing questions about environmental justice. So I think there's that kind of patterning of that broad relation that's also important.
Lovely, thank you. Moving on to a different sort of question, we have another set of questions that relate to different forms of slow violence. So people asking about whether poverty, whether neglect can be understood as forms of slow violence, and what are the implications for understanding poverty and neglect as slow violence. So Helen Woolley asks, one of the aspects of the slow violence of neglect is that children often live within it for long periods of time before meeting a threshold for rescue, she puts in scare quotes. And this can have long-term implications. So she's wondering if you can say something about this sort of, I think, relationship between slow violence and maybe some responses like the rescue response, and about slow violence and the temporalities of what particular contexts and processes we're looking at. And I'll put that to everybody as well, because I think it's a nice discussion across the piece. Would any of you like to start? Please.
Can I come in?
Please, go ahead, yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's natural for me that I touch on poverty, and there is a saying in Ghana that I'm trying to do a literal translation, that poverty is a disease, right? We tend to say that oftentimes in a jovial way, when you think that it makes one look like somebody with mental challenges, or sometimes even somebody who has completely gone mad. All right, but it's all because of the problems that poverty imposes on people, so that sometimes they are unable to lead a normal life from the perspective of somebody who hasn't experienced such a thing. And if you think along those lines, or you think along the way people jovially make this statement that poverty is a disease, then you can think of how it is not something that happens to us like it happens once and that's the end of it. It has a long-term life debilitating experience on people who are unable to get out of that bracket of poverty. If you have a disease, for instance, that can easily be cured by seeking medical attention, and you live in a place where the public health service is not good enough for you to have that service, and you have to find resources to pay for that yourself. In Ghana, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, we have a national healthcare system which was free for everybody. Then as a result of neoliberalism and the demand that we should privatize health and government should get out of this, people find themselves in a situation they call cash and carry, where people have to pay for their own health. Now, in such a situation, currently we have developed another national health system. But then when I make reference to that point, where the person is very, very sick, the person can cure himself or herself if the person had access to resources to seek medical attention. But the person is unable to do that because of poverty. They simply will be postponing the curing of the disease. And as they postpone, depending on the type of disease, it may be getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where the person becomes completely debilitated or may even lose their life entirely. And so it may start from a tiny point, but because of the lack of resources to do something in the here and now, and it has to stretch over a period of time, an issue of time scale has to come in, and perhaps there is the expectation that it will get better tomorrow, but it never gets better. I mean, it may lead to death, it may lead to all kinds of other complications. And we can connect that to neglect as well. The person may know very well that I have this disease, but then they keep postponing a solution to their disease and even neglect their own health because they do not have the resources to seek immediate attention. The same argument can be extended to how they look after their children, how they provide the needs of our children, how they look after their school requirements, and so on. If they are in a situation where school fees have to be paid, where our children have to be provided with school uniforms, where they may have to be given money for meals, they may just say that, okay, I think that school is not that important for now. We can postpone it to when things get better, and things might never get better, and the child may become an adult without an education. In a world where, even in Africa, without education, life can be very, very complicated. Thank you.
Another really important question. There's so much to say in relation to child protective services in the United States. I mean, you know, we have all the money for investigations and for policing families, in particular, Black and brown families and Indigenous families, but we have no money available for affordable housing, for a minimum wage that's a flourishing wage. Karen Gustafson's work really looks at the development of child protective services in the United States and sort of that false promise of protection, and really makes the argument, and I think as does Dorothy Roberts convincingly, that child protective services is really a kind of a weaponized entity, right? Even poverty is sort of an indication of neglect, right? So I think I'm not quite sure. I mean, I often use the term state violence or structural violence, you know, in my work and my thinking to try to help draw attention to or spotlight the kind of harms that child protective services and some of those systems do. And, you know, I think using the concept of slow violence also helps us sort of recognize, you know, how that sort of what Peter was talking about, that time space factor that often makes it, you know, much more diffuse and harder to kind of point. But I would just encourage the person who asked that question. I think that we need more work critically looking at child protective services. And I was just looking forward to a couple of other questions. And I think that's a really hard place to go to, and a hard place to do kind of critical both research and kind of public policy work and teaching and learning, in part because of the sort of sentimental aura and you know, all the things that we've been sort of flagging a little bit today. But I'm really excited that someone asked that question, and I want us to continue to push that work. And I will just flag Dorothy Roberts' work, Karen Gustafson's work around, from a US-based context, that are looking at the incredible harm both historically and today those systems do in the name of child protection, right, towards in particular Black and Indigenous communities.
Just to add fairly briefly, I agree with everything that Yao and Erica have said, and just to pick up on two things. One is about governance and specifically how sometimes the effects or the workings through of slow violence when it comes to poverty might be patterned by quite kind of banal things like definitions of poverty. So, for instance, the ways in which under austerity measures in the UK in the last 10 years, notions of who deserves state support have changed. You know, the thresholds have been changed, so that suddenly just doing something like that, you know, a governmental tool as simple as that, means that a whole category, a whole group of children are apparently no longer in poverty, no longer deserving of support, yet will, as Yao says, will then have to live with the consequences of that decision, of that definition, perhaps for the rest of their lives. The other, just picking up on Erica's point, is this question of kind of, yes, absolutely, poverty is a really, really key way of and a really key important question to keep open. That I'm always struck by this question of where do we start as childhood scholars when these problems are so complex and compound? Thinking, for instance, of children living in informal settlements in Sao Paulo, again, where problems related to this kind of gang ownership of territories mean that they control electricity supplies in that place, meaning that especially girls can't go on their own to school. And it's that kind of compound nexus of issues, along with a whole range of environmental questions, which is at heart. So is it poverty or is it something else? Where do we start with our analyses is always an interesting question, I think.
Thank you very much. And I want to pick up on some of the points that you're making for the last question of the webinar. I'm going to paraphrase from Macarena Garcia, who's from the Católica University in Chile. She picked up on something you said in your presentation, Peter, which is that the concept of slow violence or thinking with violence was fairly new to you. And I think when we invited the three of you as speakers, in fact, well, most of you said something along those lines. So her question is, what does this concept do something new for you as a researcher? So thinking methodologically, thinking ethically in particular, is this something that you would, kind of want to continue working with, and how do you think it might help childhood scholars? Peter, do you want to start with this one, because it was directed in the first instance to you? Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have an immediate answer, and so this is very much a provisional answer. For me, it did do something new, because as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, it made me consider the kind of moral and affective kind of undertones of, for instance, plastics in ways that I'd not thought about before. I had read there's a lot of work about some of the kind of potential health effects of plastics and plasticizers, both in terms of human bodies and non-human bodies, so in terms of the environment. But I hadn't sort of thought about them as forms of violence. And there's then a question about what the term violence does and what it adds to those debates, and what it adds to the kind of politics of those debates. So I think it does add something. At the same time, though, it made me also kind of want to sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm just a hopeful optimist. It also made me want to sort of hold on to some of the more positive kind of alternative ways in which children and young people themselves were visioning futures. And I'm not just talking about kind of white middle class children. In fact, most of the young people who took part in our research at the school in Birmingham were not either white or middle class. Yet they were quite hopeful about some elements of plastics. They didn't just hold on to their violent impacts. And so it comes back to this question of, okay, how do we live better or beyond some of these kinds of violence? Might be generative for childhood studies scholars, perhaps especially if we think in generational terms, but that is a hugely provisional answer.
Thanks. Yao, Erica?
Saw Yao's mic was off, so I wasn't sure if Yao was going to jump in. But I think for me, it was really a helpful lens to, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the sort of the affective work that the child and ideas about childhood, have created and for the last several years. But I think that preparing for this and this conversation has made me think a little bit differently about sort of that time and space factor that Peter was flagging, and also that conversation about the dialectic or the dynamic between the first and the third world. How to map that, how to register that, what kind of writing, what kind of representation makes, is able to surface. So I think that's a question that Nixon takes up in his project, it's a project about slow violence, but it's also a project about representation as well. And I think that I've been thinking a lot about, about the techniques of representation and audiences for that work. So this conversation is sort of, and the thinking that led to this short talk today is really, was really generative around that area. So thanks for that opportunity.
I should say something similar because it's been a very, very new experience to me. I haven't really had that dimension in my work. But what it's done to me personally is to make me more hungry in terms of finding new ways of understanding what I've been doing. And in particular, introduce this more into my teaching, my postgraduate students, and see how we can use it as another lens to understand street children much better. But most importantly, perhaps motivate some of them to take this as a very serious endeavor in terms of, making us all in my country understand the concept better, so that if we want to, as some of the questions are posed by you indicated, want to re-engage with the authorities, we want new politics, new activism, maybe, when they develop the abilities because of the intellectual understandings of what all this is about, it may whet the appetite to go into maybe NGOs and things like that. But it is a great opportunity for me personally, because it's brought a whole new, if you like, open a new kind of world for me as far as street children are concerned. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the organizers, my co-organizers, Spiru and Sharada Balagopalan, and all of the attendees, let me say a really warm thank you to Yao, Erica, Peter, for joining us today for the really fascinating and insightful presentations and stimulating dialogue. I think there's lots more to say, and we look forward to hearing more from you and continuing these conversations. We will have the video of the webinar available. I'm just going to post the link here for people so that you can watch the video or share the video. We also have 2 upcoming webinars. The next one is called Childhood's Refusals, and there's a registration link somewhere there in the chat, but we'll also be circulating that shortly on the childhood listservs. And that, I think, the childhood refusals picks up on some of these questions we're talking about, which is about if categories such as childhood or the ways in which poverty is defined do enact slow violence. do restrict the possibilities of people's lives, what can be done? And the concept of refusals, I think, offers a way of thinking beyond a liberal politics of recognition. And so that's the topic we'll be taking up at our next webinar, which is on the 3rd of March, I believe. Is that right? Yes. Okay, the 3rd of March. So thank you very much, and good afternoon, good night, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.